Hello and welcome to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg and I'm here today to do a Friday Reads video where I wrap up the week in reading and ordinarily talk about bookish things that have gone on in the world. I am still thinking that there's not a whole lot to talk about right now in the bookish world anyway, so I'm going to make this a little bit more of an actual Friday Reads video. The only thing I really want to mention before we get into the Friday Reads is something I touched on in the video that I posted today as I'm filming this, but yesterday, if you're watching this on the day it posts, about some other books that are coming out this year, which is the notion of supporting your library, because there have already been a lot of changes with the current administration in the United States, and there are probably going to be a lot more. Some of the changes are going to be very expensive. It is probably going to mean that budgets are going to be cut in other areas, and I'm willing to bet a lot of those cuts are going to be in education, which is not going to be great, and anything involving the arts, including libraries. So support your local libraries as much as possible in the coming years. And supporting your local library is also a way of supporting education. They do so many great things beyond just being a place for books in your community. So a lot of how libraries are measured comes down to usage statistics, how many books are being borrowed and how many of their other services are being used. So I admit sometimes I get a book from the library knowing that I'm probably not going to get it, because I figure if I'm checking it out, I'm helping the library and I don't mind checking something out and returning it because, anyway, it just helps the library and their numbers. There have even been instances where I have picked up something that I had on hold, knew that I wasn't going to be reading it at that moment, checked it out, walked over to the book drop and returned it. I have done that just because I kind of want to help libraries. So that is something that is going to be really important and something to think about as you look for books that you want to add to your TBR this year and beyond. And also supporting your local independent bookstore is going to be more important than ever, because somebody pointed out in a comment on that video that more books are likely to be banned. Like, the amount of books that have been banned has already been skyrocketing, and it's probably only going to get worse in coming years. So it's important to do what you can to support bookstores that are helping to put these books in people's hands, and authors as well. So I know times are tough financially as well. If you don't have the means to support these authors by buying a copy of a book, that is fine. Use your library, because the library is, again, such a great resource for your community. And, that's my little soapbox thing for the coming years, just making sure this is something that's going to be important. And as bookish people, I'm assuming if you watch this video, you are a bookish person. It just seemed like it would make sense. I imagine you're not really here for my charm or wit. But anyway, it's going to be something that's really important for us. And in my last Friday Reads, I had talked about The Catcher in the Rye and my reread of that, and floated the question about whether or not people would be interested in a video in defense of The Catcher in the Rye, because I feel like this is somewhat of a maligned book. And rereading it really cemented the idea to me that this is actually my favorite book of all time. I have traditionally, in the last few years, felt almost embarrassed about confessing that, because I know a lot of people don't like Holden Caulfield, and I see why a lot of people don't like Holden Caulfield. So I'd sort of apologetically say, well, that's probably my favorite book, but I see why a lot of people don't like it. I think this is actually a monumental achievement. And Holden is such a fascinating character. He is unlikable in certain ways, but he's going through stuff. So, point just being, most people commented to say that they would like to see that in defense video. So I am going to work on it. I don't know if I'll manage to finish it before January, because we're almost through January. Can you believe that? I can't. So it might happen in February. I want to try to do it right. So it might take me a little bit of time. I don't want to do like a full-on video like one of my Pulitzer deep dives, but it might approach the level of that. We'll see. I really only barely started working on it. So that is something that will be coming. And with that, let's just do Friday Reads and talk about the books that I finished. It has been an interesting reading week. There were 2 books that I had been working on in my last Friday Reads video, which will be linked down below. along with affiliate links to all of the books that I discuss in this video. Because PSA, if you use those links, if I spark an interest in that, bookshop.org supports independent bookstores. Libro.fm supports independent bookstores. So if you purchase from them, it helps independent bookstores, but because that's an affiliate link, it would also give a little bit of a kickback to me. So, but there will be links to all of the books I talk about, along with my last Friday reads and other videos that might be interesting to you. So the only books that I finished this week were the books that I had in progress last week. And my reading has been, I'm so close to being done with another book, and I really wanted to finish it today before I could film this video, and it just didn't happen. So we'll get to that one. So the first book that I finished was The Anthropologists by Aysegul Savage, and I don't have my copy of it right now because I had to return it to the library. And it's a very short book. It's 200 pages-ish. I think it's even a little bit less. And last week I said if you are someone who, like me, enjoys the work of Jhumpa Lahiri, this would be a good book for you, especially Jhumpa Lahiri's recent work. And I'm thinking most specifically about Whereabouts. If that's a book that you really enjoyed, I would absolutely say check out The Anthropologists. It is such an interesting, well thought out book. And this is a case where there's sort of a central metaphor, like studies of anthropology and using that as a way of looking at your life and looking at each other and your family and trying to figure out where you fit in those dynamics. Anthropology is something that you study, but also something you're applying to your real life and trying to figure out who you are and where you fit in. That's really interesting. Sometimes some authors can do those things in very heavy-handed ways, and Aysegul Savage does not do that at all. These are handled very deftly, and the premise of it is that you have a couple who are looking for a new apartment, and the process of looking for a new apartment is conflated with the idea that they are trying to decide what the next phase of their lives are going to be. And I read a passage to you last week that dealt with this sensation of being an acrobat, trying to make a leap without knowing where you're going to land. And it's a bit of an early adulthood novel in that way, where this is a couple who is in that critical stage where they're trying to figure out who they can be, because the more you make decisions, the more other options start to close off in your life. And they're almost too aware of that, at least our protagonist. It centers more on the female in the relationship, and not that it's a given that a male and female are required for a relationship, but this is a heterosexual couple. So the female takes the center stage more and you're more in her head than anyone else is. And she is certainly aware of that. And as they look at apartments, they try to envision, like, would this be the bodega we would go to? Is this the cafe we would go to? And there's also a sense that it's impossible to decide these things, because when they moved into the apartment they currently live in, they had thought, okay, well, that's the coffee shop we're going to go to all the time. And they just never really went there at all. So, but it's using all of this to talk about figuring your life out. And it's so fascinating and so interesting. I see why so many people had liked this book. And it ended up on, I think it was Publishers Weekly's Best Books of 2024. And it's a fascinating book. I can't wait to read more by Aysegul Savage, because it is, and that's why I feel this strong comparison to Jhumpa Lahiri. Well, that's not the only reason, but it feels like it reads like something that is very subtle and quiet, and there's so much going on underneath the surface. And that's a very Jhumpa Lahiri thing. I think it also lulls you into the prose, and then there will be a sentence that is just so insightful that it kind of floors you for a moment before you can continue reading. And that is another Jhumpa Lahiri thing. And I see that with Aysegul Savage. So I really enjoyed this book. And it's funny. I think in recent years, I have always found a book in January that ends up being one of my favorite reads of the year. Last year, I thought the spell or the streak was finally going to end because I had a very sort of mid January in 2024. And then right at the end of the month, I stumbled onto Hello Beautiful by Ann Napolitano, and that did end up being one of my favorite books of the year. I feel like I'm having the opposite problem this year because I have an embarrassment of riches. I talked last week about how I had finished Endurance. I feel like that could easily be my favorite nonfiction read of 2024. I finished The Catcher in the Rye. I don't really include rereads, but that's a favorite. The Anthropologists, I don't know that it will end up in my top 10 by the end of the year, but I feel like it's at least guaranteed to be in my honorable mentions for the year. It's that good. And the two books that I also finished, Desert Solitaire, that could easily be in my top 5 for nonfiction. And the fiction book that I'm currently reading could, again, easily be one of my favorites. So January has just been an embarrassment of riches this year, and The Anthropologist is definitely part of that. So that was what I had been reading in physical form, and the book I had been listening to on audio was Desert Solitaire by Edward Abbey. And if you follow along, Joel and I both read this in the month of January, and we invited other people to read as well, and got some comments last week from people who had either read this in the past or have been reading this. We lost our friend Leon at the end of December, and Leon was a huge Edward Abbey fan. She even named her dog after Edward Abbey, and that's the level of fan she was of his writing, and Desert Solitaire was her favorite book. So in honor of her, we wanted to make sure we read this in the month of January. And it's kind of interesting because when I checked in with you last week in my Friday reads, I was at the middle of the book. And the middle of the book, I feel like there's definitely a sag in the middle of the book. And part of that is that it's starting to talk about other things. Like it opens with him being a ranger in the area of Moab and everything that he sees and experiences while he's there. And then he sort of fans out a little bit and talks about other things in the middle. And then the book picks up again when he starts getting back to being a ranger in Moab. And in that middle, there are also some things that really didn't age well. And specifically, he goes on a whole thing about indigenous people, particularly the Navajo, and it's pretty offensive. So I happened to have just been in the middle or just gotten through that part when I did my last Friday read. So that is the majority of what I talked about in my last Friday reads video. And now that I'm finished, I can look at the book as a whole, and it definitely opens very strong. It ends very strong, which I think definitely makes it worth the read. And there is an element to this that is almost sad to read because basically he is talking about nature and the experience of nature and ways we need to do better to protect these lands, such as Moab. And he was right. We did need to do better to protect areas like this. And the reason it's sad is that we did not do better. Moab in particular has become a huge tourist destination, and the impacts of that tourism have been heavy and serious, and it has drastically changed the landscape. And, some part of that comes down to the fact that people can be bad tourists who are irresponsible, people wrecking the landscape and things like that. A lot of that has happened in Moab. So a lot of the stuff that he talks about and the dangers of what happens if we don't do much to protect these lands, those have come true. He was right about that. And it was already happening in 1967 or 68 when he wrote this book. It's copyright 1968. And it's only gotten worse and will probably only continue to get worse because now we're also seeing drastic effects of climate change and all of that. And that is impacting tourist areas. And it's something I have thought about when Joel and I went to Italy and when we were in Ireland and Scotland, specifically when we went to Giant's Causeway in Ireland and areas like that. You want to protect these incredible landmarks. So that's a lot of what Edward Abbey is writing about. And his observations about nature are really interesting in how to experience and think about the world. He is a very cranky man, but he's a kind of likably cranky man, and that makes this a really good experience. This is one of the 2 copies that were gifted to me by our friend Leon, and you can tell that this is a book that has been well loved. So part of me wishes that she had underlined passages, because that would have been just another level of great. But so I'm really glad that I read this book, as much as the middle part I think does kind of lose its way. And he does later in the book also make this wildly unnecessary dig at the Navajo again. Like he just I think, if I remember correctly, he refers to a Navajo man on the street as lazy, and it's kind of like, where did that come from? Oh, Edward Abbey. So that's not great. That part's not great. But his observations about nature are definitely worth the while. And it is beautiful. And knowing what happened over the last 50 years since he published this book, and how he was right, and we didn't do enough to protect these spaces, and we continue to not do enough. And thinking about what the current administration is going to do to make that worse. It's a good book. I would recommend it. And I've enjoyed reading this with other people. So those are the 2 books that I finished. I'm so close. I'm so close to being done with Isaac's Song by Daniel Black. This was one of my and Joel's most anticipated books of 2025. That video will be linked down below. And we were both so excited to read this book because it is a follow-up to Daniel Black's book, Don't Cry for Me. In Don't Cry for Me, the novel is essentially a series of letters that a father is writing to his son. I kind of think of it as Razorblade Tears without the revenge plotline and without the violence, because it's about a father who was homophobic and estranged himself from his gay son. And now he is dying of cancer. So he starts writing letters to his son. And usually I have to kind of roll my eyes a little bit at the trope of a novel in letters, where somebody's just writing a letter. Like there's a book called like Dear American Airlines that is about 200 pages, and it's all supposed to be one letter that a man is writing to American Airlines. And you kind of think, nobody writes a letter this long. That's not the way it is. So each chapter is a letter that he writes, but it works here because basically when he has time or thoughts, he will write a letter. He does not actually intend to send these letters to his son. He wants his son to get the letters after he is gone, because the way he thinks about it, it's too late for forgiveness. It's too late to atone for the things that he has done. But he wants his son to understand why he was the way that he was and why he had such a difficult time accepting his son. So that's what Don't Cry for Me is. It was one of my favorite books the year I read it. It is still one of my favorites. Usually it lives faced out on my shelf right here. You can see that little gap. That's where this is usually faced out. Absolutely wonderful book. Isaac's Song is about the son. It's essentially the same story, but from the son's perspective. And it does involve him getting the letters that his father wrote. But it builds up to that. I think I had been expecting this to be much more of a response to the letters. Like the book would open with Isaac getting the letters, and that's not the way it plays out. It does open with Isaac dealing with losing his father and his mixed emotions about that. He's in therapy, and his therapist asks him to begin writing about his feelings about his family. I'm actually listening to this on audio, but I kind of want to see if... Okay, yeah. So day 3. The therapist encourages him to sort of keep a journal where he thinks about his family. So like day 3 is his reflections on his family and his history that he wrote on day 3. And you get a lot of... There's a lot of echoing stories that were told in Don't Cry for Me, but from this different perspective. And I actually don't think you need to read Don't Cry for Me first. It's impossible for me to separate my experience of these books from how I think other people should, because part of the poignancy of reading Isaac's Song is knowing the father's perspective on these stories and hearing Isaac's version and how they bounce off of each other. But I feel like you could get the same thing if you read Isaac's Song first and then read Don't Cry for Me after it. So the order doesn't really matter, but I would actually really encourage you to do both. And so there are ways in which Isaac's Song is not the book I had really anticipated, but it's actually a better book for that. Because what Daniel Black is doing is so much more interesting. And the description of the book talks about, yet just as he begins to embrace who he is, two social catalysts, the AIDS crisis and Rodney King's attack, collectively extinguish his hard-earned joy. So I think I had expected a lot more content about the AIDS epidemic and about Rodney King. Those are in here, but that description of the book made me think they were going to be much larger presences than they actually are. It's much more about all of the things that have shaped Isaac and made his life turn out the way it has. And in Don't Cry for Me, you don't actually really know what Isaac is currently up to because the father and Isaac, Jacob is the father. Jacob and Isaac have been estranged. They don't know much about each other's lives at that point. So you don't really know the man that Isaac has become. And here you get to know who he has become and why he has become that, which again echoes Don't Cry for Me, because Jacob is telling his story of his childhood and the forces that shaped him to be the man that he had ended up being. And another one of the things I really love about this book is, you know, I don't make a secret of it. I have been seeing a therapist for a couple of years at this point, and it has been extremely helpful to me, not only in dealing with grief over the last few years, but in sorting through difficult family stuff that I have carried with me since I was a child. And a lot of that has helped me reframe my relationships with my parents. And, you know, we don't need to get into a lot of specifics, but when I was a child, I always thought of my mother as the villain of the story for many legitimate reasons. And I always thought of my father as the hero. And as I got older, you know, there's still no way of really excusing the things that my mother did. But I think working with a therapist, I have come to realize that she was not in control. And I actually do have a friendly relationship with my mother now. So the parent who hurt me the most as a child is actually the only one I have a relationship with at this moment, because I did get an acknowledgement, sort of like an apology for the way things were when I was a kid. And we've sort of moved uneasily at first, moved past that. And we have a friendly relationship. And part of that is that she loves Joel. But anyway, and I don't actually talk to my father. And I've mentioned that previously. And part of that is that as I've gotten older, I have looked back at things that happened and realized that maybe he wasn't actually the hero that I made him out to be. Maybe a lot of the things that he did harmed me, if not worse than the things that my mother did, just as badly, because he allowed a lot of those things to continue. And again, we don't need to get into it. But basically, Isaac is going through a lot of that in therapy. He has held his mother up as a hero and demonized his father. And in the process of therapy, he's going back and he's not exactly having the same situation as me. Like, he doesn't end up thinking, wow, my mom was actually the demon and my father was a hero. Like, that's not his conclusion. But he does start to see the shades of gray, where there are areas that his mother actually hurt him. And, you know, when it talks about the extinguishing his hard-earned joy, part of that is also on his mother, who he has always held up as this hero and the person who loved him. And he also sees the support that his father gave him and tried to give him, even though it's just such a beautiful novel about generational trauma and the ways we respond to the way we are raised and how it affects our life going forward. And this book in particular is about trying to interrupt that cycle, which is something I've really thought about in my life. It's why I love all of these books about complicated families. It's why I love books about generational trauma and things like that. It's something that I have really been working on. And Isaac's Song is hitting all of those beats. It's a very powerful and intelligent novel. And I relate to it so hard, even though a lot of it is also about the experience of being a Black gay man. And not just a gay man, but a Black man in this country, and the ways in which racism has shaped Isaac's life, as well as his father's life and his grandfather's life, and so on, all the way back. I have not experienced that. I've experienced homophobia, but I haven't experienced homophobia and racism. And so even though there are aspects of the novel that I can appreciate and empathize with, but I don't have firsthand experience with, I relate to this book so hard, and it's lovely. I could easily see this being my favorite book of the year, but I have an hour left in the audio. I was so close to being done. I can't wait to see how it wraps up. It has been burning a hole in my soul all day that I haven't been able to finish that last hour of the audio. So I will talk more about this next week, but I am loving this book so far. I cannot tell you enough good things about it. Interestingly, the only semi-dud that I've had this week is a book that I'm not actually far enough in to really talk about. I usually have a rule. I have to get at least 50 pages into a book before I consider it something that I'm reading, or before I really talk about it. But I mentioned that it was probably going to be my next book last week, and it ate up a lot of my reading time this week. So I'm going to mention it. Mammoth by Eva Baltazar, translated by Julia Sanchez. I started to say this is the only dud of the month, and I stopped myself immediately because I have not read enough of this book to say that for sure. I am on page 22. Now, I've just been having a really hard time getting into this book, which is surprising because it is a short book. It is 103 pages, and it actually starts on page 9. So it's a short book. Also, I loved Boulder by Eva Baltazar, which was, I think, shortlisted for the International Booker Prize. So I'm just really struggling to get into it, and I've been trying to read it like all week. I finished The Anthropologists on Monday or Tuesday, and I'm filming this on Friday, and I've only gotten, and again, it starts on page 9, and I'm on page 23. So that's how long it has taken me to get that far into the book. And I think maybe I'm just not in the mindset for this right now, but there are elements where maybe this is a translation issue, but maybe not, because Julia Sanchez, I think, did a great job with Boulder, a book I absolutely loved. But so on this one little page, there are examples of why I've had some trouble getting into this book. There will be a line that I absolutely love, and then it'll feel like it's trying too hard to have another line like that. So at the beginning of page 22, it says, "I was comfortable in that corner. Comfort was a web spun between all the things that kept me safe. The threadbare sweater I wore at home, the darkened crack on the inside of my teacup, my feet tucked under the blanket." And I read that, and I just want to cozy up into that sentence like it's a warm blanket. And it's great, but then it goes on and it just keeps getting complicated. It feels like it's trying to repeat a line like that, and it gets overly complicated to me. Then came the shipwreck, splintering, followed by sinking, like an oil tanker rent in half, an amputated continent. The body can hold a freezing ocean with depths of unseen abundance where everything sleeps in captivity. I learned this on my birthday. The first time was like catching a tropical disease, so abrupt and alienating it turned my whole body purple and green, feverish and achingly heavy. And it just starts to feel like too much. So I think that's why I'm having a hard time. Maybe I'm just not in the right mental space for this, and I'm surprised because I loved Boulder. And I do think part of it is coming from the text of the book, but I also wonder if I'm just really not in the headspace. And I think what's going to happen is tomorrow is going to be D-Day for Mammoth, because I've been struggling to get into it for a couple of days now. If tomorrow morning I can't make significant progress in this book, I think I'm just going to return it to the library and move on to the next book, which is surprising. And maybe at some point later in the year, I'll revisit Mammoth, because I want to get through it. Even if I am feeling like it's trying a little too hard in some spaces, I loved Boulder. And there are those good lines like that one I wanted to cozy up in like a warm blanket. So tomorrow will be D-Day, where I decide if I'm going to continue trying to work my way into this book or if I'm going to let it go. And I don't usually like talking about books that I'm not significantly into at this point, but that's just my impression of the struggle that I'm having getting into it so far. If I don't continue on with Mammoth, I have two options from the library. I did read a little bit of the first chapter of Black River by Nilanjana Roy and immediately decided it's not a book that I want to read right now, so I returned it to my library because it opens with the murder of a child. And I know the rest of the book is about solving that murder, but it just doesn't feel like something I want to read right now. It's stressing me out. So I have two library books left right now that I would be able to choose from. One I showed you last week, and another one I just picked up this week. First is Grief is Love by Marissa Renee Lee. This had been recommended to me by my therapist. I think the most likely scenario, if I don't continue with Mammoth, is that I would pick this up, because this is also a very short book. And yeah, it's under 200 pages, but this is also short. So I think this is the most likely one because it's something my therapist has been recommending to me, and I think it might be something I need right now. So that's the most likely one. But I also got Our Spoons Came from Woolworths by Barbara Comins. And this had been featured in one of Ann Patchett's videos for the Parnassus Bookstore Instagram page, where every Friday she does a video. If you haven't read this, it's new to you. She had featured this one on there. So this is copyright 1950. And she really got me hooked into the idea of reading this book. It is also under 200 pages. So I feel like I could easily get into this too. But I think I might try to prioritize Grief is Love, and we'll see. And when I finish the audio of Isaac Song, I actually don't know what my next audiobook will be. I have to make that decision this weekend because I'm hoping by the end of today I will be done with it. So that is everything that I have had going on in my reading life this week. I would love to hear what you've had going on, what you've been reading, loving, watching. What did you think of the Oscar nominations and all of that? Let me know in the comment section down below. As always, I really appreciate your time, and I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.